The New York Times reported about her meetings in Indiana and called her the trance evangelist. She'd go to jail several times for practicing medicine without a license throughout the northern part of America. Her name was Woodworth-Etter. She was known as the Signs and Wonders and became the grandmother of the Pentecostal movement. I'm Robert Sturden, and this is God's Generals. In 1844, in Lisbon, Ohio, Maria Woodworth-Etter was born. She'd be the first lady in Pentecostal circles to be called the grandmother of the movement. She'd have all 9 gifts of the Spirit, practicing divine healing, casting out demons, and believing in women preachers all before the Azusa Street revival of 1906, which in history we say is the date that the modern Pentecostal movement began. But she predates all of it with all the power, signs, wonders, and controversies and criticisms. And we're going to enjoy looking at her life, because her life also develops a mantle that lives today in American religious scenes. The great healing mantle that we've seen on Mother Etter came to Amy Sybil McPherson, came to Catherine Kuhlman, and came to Benny Hinn. This mantle of healing has gone from every generation since its conception in the life of Mrs. Etter. She was not raised in a Christian family like most of you and I was. She was raised in agricultural time in American history. And when she was baptized in water, they said a great light came and held over her for a while, which signified to the country people that there was something special about this girl that God had planned for her life. When she finally began to become aware of God in her life and wanted to seek the Lord, her brothers and sisters told her to quit being so religious and, pushed her aside or made fun of her, but she stayed true to her inner convictions. But then one day she had a vision. It's about a 2.5-hour vision, she states in her journal, that she went out into the Spirit and she saw herself standing in a great field of wheat. And all of a sudden, in this vision, the wheat began to fall all around her to the ground. And the voice of the Lord spoke to her and said, "The slain of the Lord shall be many through your ministry." She'd come into that to mean 2 things. That people get saved by the thousands, and the phenomena of being slain in the Spirit would become one of the unique signs that would follow her preaching and her praying. And that's the way she believed that God communicated to her that her ministry would have these type of things happening early in her life. She got married to a Civil War veteran. She tried to be, like a normal family, husband, wife. They had 6 children. They were farmers. All of her children died but one. Her last daughter, Lizzie as they called her, lived, but she actually would bury Lizzie before she would die. So in honesty, Maria Woodworth-Etter's life, all of her husbands would die, all of her kids would die, and then she would die alone with just her friends and her church family around her. So that's kind of tragic. But before we get into all the ending of her life, let's get her into the ministry. You have to realize, too, that in the middle 1800s and the early 1900s, women preachers were not accepted. So she began to pioneer not the power of the Holy Spirit, but also help pioneer the acceptance of women ministry. When she finally said yes to call to preach, she told her husband, "Let's go for ministry. The farm's not working. Our children are going through death and sickness and things. Let's go for God." So there was no alternative. He said yes. So she went and sought ordination from a little ministerial group in Ohio. And they thought, well, since she's being persistent, we'll ordain her and she'll go away. When they ordained her, she didn't go away. So they thought, well, let's do number 2, and maybe this will make her go away. Let's send her to the worst place we know and let her go try to do a revival meeting there. They called the place the Devil's Den. So she goes there and starts a meeting. Other preachers had tried. Their best preachers had tried to hold revival meetings and plant a church there, and they all failed. So the brethren thought this would be a sure way to get rid of Mother Etter. She goes there and starts preaching. Nothing happens, but one unique thing is happening. It's a woman preacher. So the crowd comes. Realize, folks, there's no TV, there's no radio, there's no internet, there's no anything. So when there's the oddity of a woman preacher in town, you show up because that's town entertainment. So they begin to come to see the woman preacher, and slowly breakthrough happens. And she stays there long enough to establish a church and a Sunday school of over 200 people. Now, in those days, Sunday school was like today, the cell group ministry is today. All over the world, the cell ministry is exploding and it's going. It's a way that the churches are growing and extending the ministry of Christ in the earth. In those days, the concept of Sunday school was brand new. So for this woman to establish a church and a successful Sunday school in the devil's den made this group of preachers say, God is with this woman. Their attitude changed. They began to get behind her, and she became their #1 church planter in this network of churches in the state of Ohio and Indiana. When we come back, we're going to start talking about the miracles and the unusual manifestations that God did through her. After she became successful as a church planter with the group of ministers that she was with in Ohio and throughout Indiana, she began to travel to other states, and her notoriety began to gain in the national consciousness of America. She was looked upon as one of the top 10 preachers of that time period. Now, to explain Mother Etter's life and ministry, we have to kind of picture for a moment what a meeting would be like in those days. Number one, they were in a tent like we are here today, and they did not have hotels or microphones. They drove the old-timey cars, and they had the old-timey trucks. And if there was not a home for her to stay in, she'd put up her own tent outside the big tent, and that's where she would sleep. Her meetings would go from 7 weeks to 7 months, every night and every morning. Now, some of us get tired. We have to go to church 3 times a week, or we go to church and the preacher preaches an extra hour or 30 minutes, or it goes beyond our normal Sunday morning comfort. But can you imagine her meetings go from 7 weeks to 7 months, and it would start at 9 o'clock in the morning, and some of them would not end until midnight, and there was no breaks. She would just roll them all day long and just keep going and let the Spirit of God move. Now, there'd be singing, of course, there'd be preaching, but then the Spirit of God began to do different things in the crowd. Healings would take place, demons would be cast out. Now, the unique thing that would happen would be people would fall into trances. Now, that's why she got called by Dowie and others who became her critics, this trance evangelist or evangelism they thought was of the devil. Now, what would happen in her meetings? Why she'd be preaching, people that were Christians and that were not Christians, both men and women, young and old, anybody, the Spirit of God would come on, and they would go into a trance. Now, a trance is something where your body freezes and you go out and you see something that God wants you to see. They would see heaven, they would see hell, angels, demons, or pictures from their life that God would show them, and they would come back and talk about it, or want to get saved, or they have some type of thing they need to talk about and get right with God. And so that's how it would begin to happen. Now, these people would go into trances. Some would go for 10 minutes, she'd say, 30 minutes, all day, all night, and some longer she wrote about. So we have all different types of lengths of these trances and manifestations of God's power that would happen in Maria's meetings. Now, she did not orchestrate that. She was probably in the beginning the most shocked by it, even when it happened to her. And so what happens was, when this would begin to take place and begin to get talked about in the newspapers and noise about, some of the holiness preachers moved away from her. They thought she was crazy, but the crowds kept coming. Now, you win a nation by the common man. You don't spend time answering the academic critics or your skeptics who don't want an answer. Jesus won by talking to the common middle class man of society. And that's where Maria Woodworth-Etter won her case. Her crowds grew, her excitement grew among that group of people. Now, she'd be arrested a couple times in her life because at this time in America, they would use the law that Dowie would change in his court trial of practicing medicine without a license. The last time she was arrested, she was 69 years old, and they put her on trial. And in this book here, she wrote about 4 books. And it's like reading the book of Acts again, because it's meeting by meeting account of what happened, good, bad, and ugly. And in this book here from 1916, she wrote about the court case and the trial and the questions and answers. And it's very interesting. Well, when did this begin to happen? She said, well, it began to happen in the early days, and they thought she was into hypnosis, and did she study that and all that? She goes, I did not study any of that. I was preaching, and it began to happen, and at first it caught her off guard. Now, the thing I want to also share about is, in the Bible, we have trances being listed. That's one of the kinds of visions that God gives. There's the inward vision, there is the open vision, there's the trance, and there's the night vision or the dream. And so Peter went up on the rooftop while they were fixing lunch, the book of Acts says, and he fell into a trance. And he saw the sheet come down with the unclean creatures on it, and the voice of God said, kill and eat. Now, that's where the Bible records an example of a biblical record of God putting a person in a trance and talking to them. So this is some of the things that Maria Woodworth-Etter dealt with throughout her whole life. And John G. Lake said, I always found it interesting that he said to his young crowd and his own disciples, pray like Mother Etter would pray. Mother Etter was not a present-day, nice, little seeker-friendly church prayer warrior. She was a very forceful, very strong, very authoritative, and very direct type of prayer. And she'd walk back and forth across the stage praying and praising God with her hand up in the air, encouraging people to get right with God and to move as the Spirit of God moved her to speak and to say things to the crowd or to individuals. So she's about 5'3", about the same height of John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church. And she comes out of the holiness movement. She wore very plain clothes and had the little bun in her hair, as you'll see in the pictures. And that's the way that she would travel and work. Now, in her life and ministry, she had to defend herself to some degree by being a woman preacher. Remember, women preachers at this time were not something that the church accepted very readily. But when God's with you, you can make it. She did not spend a lot of time defending herself. She'd preach sermons once in a while that God used women in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and He'll use women in the last days. And she was a part of the last days army, and she was glad to be one of God's generals, moving the troops and getting people ready for the coming of the Lord. So I'm very happy to say I believe in women preachers. Women preachers have always been in the kingdom of God's work, and they'll remain. So if you're watching me today and you don't believe in women preachers, get over it. They're here and they're here to stay. And they're going to get louder and there's going to be more of them. If you are a woman preacher, do not let people take away from you who you are, how God called you, and what you're supposed to do. Just go do it and enjoy it. Don't answer the critics. Let your fruit answer all their questions. Now, Maria Woodworth-Etter had a desire to go to the West Coast. She always felt like God would give her a special meeting in California or Washington, Oregon. Most of her meetings at this time have been done in the Midwest and out east and the South. But finally, she got an invitation to go to Oakland, California. So she takes her tent and takes her team and drives to California. And this happens to be the worst meeting of her entire life. And so she goes out there, sets up the tent, begins to preach. People begin to get saved and healing and trances start. And the city people begin to fight her. That was her first war. The city people had given her permit thinking she was just going to be a nice little Christian meeting and she would just preach Jesus and go away. Well, they didn't know that a force of change had come to the city, and she was not quiet and she wouldn't go away. And so they tried to take her permit away, but she won that case. Then the hoodlums, as they would say, around the town came and began to cut the ropes while the people were inside worshiping and praising God and having the service. They'd cut the ropes and the tent would fall on them. So they had to stop the meeting, set the tent back up, and they wouldn't send policemen to help her because the town wanted to get rid of her. Well, when that didn't happen, and to close her down, they thought, well, let's bring the insane people. So they went out into the hospitals for the insane people and brought them into the tent and released them into the tent. So you had mentally ill people manifesting, reacting, doing all kinds of things, along with the hoodlums, along with the demons, along with the power of God that was doing good things, all at the same time. And she didn't give up. She kept going. Now, that's not the worst case. Here comes some more. While she's going through all of this, keeps going and keeps preaching. Something about these old-time preachers that we need today, they don't get bothered enough to quit or give up when things go bad or things don't go good. They know how to persevere and go forward. They stay in a place until the breakthrough happens in the heavens and in the earth. Well, then one of the great trials begins to happen in her personal life. Her husband has an affair with an African-American woman. Now, an affair is bad enough, but when it's an African-American woman at this time period in American history, that's also another degree of depth to the scandal. So her husband has an affair, runs off with this woman during this California meeting, and ends up leaving her, and they end up getting divorced. So that happens during the case. Dowey had come over, befriended her, and then turned against her and got the papers to fight her. Then she gives a prophecy that if Oakland and San Francisco does not get right with God, there's going to come some type of city judgment because of the rebellion against God. Well, her followers, like any followers, can take what you say, add to it, or say it in a different way that makes it mean something totally different. So what happens when that prophecy or that urgency comes forth as a warning to not reject God, but to warm up to Him and to give their life to God and to live right, her followers begin to put a date when this is going to happen. And what it's going to be is a great earthquake. And it's going to destroy San Francisco. And so the newspapers take this and begin to spin it into new degrees of persecution. And so as I've gone through the research, she never put a date on it. She just said, here's what she felt, here's what she sensed. Her followers did. So the date came and there was no earthquake. The followers and her all looked like a bunch of fanatical weirdos and everything, but she didn't give up until she felt that she'd finished her purpose in that meeting. One of the unusual miracles that happened during this meeting in California, among the other things that we could talk about, is there was a man that came and began to heckle her and disturb the crowd, and she warned him that if he didn't stop it, God was going to judge him. And so he kept mocking her, making fun of all the things that she was saying, that she couldn't be a woman preacher, and this was a bunch of fanaticism, and it was of the devil and all that stuff. And all of a sudden, she just said, well, God's going to judge you. You've crossed the line. And that's it. All of a sudden, as he was still trying to heckle her and disturb the crowd and close the meeting, his tongue began to swell up to where he could not talk. And he ran out of the tent in fear. And as he went on his way home, he said his tongue swelled up too much where his tongue hung on the outside of his mouth down to about here in the middle of his chin. And it wouldn't go down. So after several days of his tongue being like that, where he couldn't drink much and he couldn't talk and he couldn't eat, he got scared, and his family kind of, well, you better go back and talk to that woman and ask her to fix you. No, he didn't want to, I guess. But when your tongue hangs out like that for a day or two, you start changing your heart and your mind. So he comes back into the tent and motions to her that he needed her help, and she stops the meeting, and she says, what do you want? And he kind of communicated to her, I want to be fixed. And she said, I'm not going to pray for you to get fixed unless you get right with God and get right with him now. And so he got ready to get right with God, and she led him in the sinner's prayer, and he mumbled it out the best that he could. And then she hauled off and slapped his face, and his tongue went down and became normal. That to me was one of the most unusual miracles in that meeting. With all the disasters going on, there's that one like that, and that man later becomes a pastor in his life and serves the Lord for the rest of his life. And so that's a great story that I like. Can you imagine somebody heckling you and your tongue swells up and it won't go down and you get right? That would bless a few people in some places around America today or in the world today, to make people get right if something like that would happen. I wouldn't mind God doing that in a few of my meetings, and that would put some fear in the right hearts. It'd be good. There's so much to tell about Maria Woodworth-Etter and her life and all the stories. She wrote 4 big books, and it's like reading the book of Acts again. She wrote about each meeting, what happened good, what happened bad, who God healed, if there was a struggle, what it was. And we hope that you will find them and read them. They are, one's called Signs and Wonders, the other one's Marvels and Miracles, Acts of the Holy Ghost. And the fourth one was a little book she wrote when she was just when she was Mrs. Woodworth. And so those are great books. I've read all of them, and they're phenomenal stories. I need to bring this to a close very fast, but there's so much to tell. When I come back, we're going to talk about the latter part of her life, where she builds the Etter Tabernacle in Indiana. She meets Amy Sybil McPherson. She buries her last daughter, a little bit sadness of her life. And then I'm going to have something very special for you. I found the only film footage that is known of Maria Woodworth-Etter about a year before she died. So we're going to be able to show you her walking. There's no voice, but at least it's silent film footage of Mrs. Etter. Everybody has a great meeting, and everybody has a terrible meeting. Mother Etter just finished the worst meeting of her life up in Oakland, California, where Dowie came against her, the city came against her. They brought the mentally ill and released them in the tent. The hoodlums cut down the ropes and made the tent fall on the people. Her husband runs off with a woman, has an affair, and then they have a prophecy that her followers take out of context and it causes a scandal. So it could be one of those things where you almost want to quit and give up. But she goes to St. Louis after that and has one of her great salvation healing meetings where she baptizes people in the river, and she falls into a trance that lasts for 3 days and 3 nights. Kenneth Hagin records, reading about in one of the Christian PR articles of the time. Can you imagine being in a trance for 3 days and 3 nights? They bring in the doctors, they poke her with pins, the smelling salts, they slap her. But when you're out, you're out. They say when she came back, she picked up in the sentence where she left off and kept preaching and did not know that she'd been gone for that amount of time. When they asked her, where'd you go? What'd you see? She said, I've just been out communing with the Father, seeing heaven and seeing the future and seeing different things. I wish it had been more detailed, and wrote a whole chapter in her book about what she saw while she was gone for that length of time. In her life after that, she remarries a man named Samuel Etter. Now, Samuel Etter was known as what we would call today a ministry of helps person. Mr. Woodworth was not quite of the same disposition. Samuel Etter loved helping people in the altar, setting the tent up, selling the refreshments, selling the books, helping in every way he could, help his wife and the people seeking salvation and healing. People loved him. In her journals, she only writes about him a little bit, and then there's what we call the silent years in her life. I think it's about 14 years where she does not record much of her preaching or her crusades or her meetings like she did in the other times of her life. I think what happened, she had a good marriage, good things had begun to happen, and she just relaxed and enjoyed life. And the meetings she had were just the ones that she had, and she did not write about them as some type of big campaign or big crusade. At this time, she's become the great mother of the Pentecostal movement. The Pentecostal movement is a baby in its infant stage. She's senior, she's mature, she's the elder statesman, and all the young Pentecostals look to her as somebody they can follow, get advice from, and how to work with the gifts of the Spirit, how to flow in healing, how to cast out devils, and how to have successful healing campaigns. She could go to Dallas and work with F.F. Bosworth to help build the first Assemblies of God church there. But as she gets older, she has two tragedies that happen. Samuel Etter passes away, she buries him, and then when back in Indianapolis, Indiana, where her headquarters are, her daughter is walking across the street one day and gets hit by a car, and she dies. So in Mother Etter's life, she buries both husbands and all of her children before she dies. That's really not the way life should be lived or how the natural flow of life should be done. Can you imagine the tragedy and the heartbreak when she saw that her only living daughter, she had to do the funeral for and buried her? So as she got older, she did not travel much. She built a big church that they called the Etter Tabernacle. Today, it's the Great Assemblies of God Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. I think it's called Lakeview Christian Center is what it's called. And in her older years, she began to lose the strength to walk and to stand. So before church, they would get her dressed and put her in her chair, and they'd walk her across because her house and the church were next door to each other. And they'd walk her across in the chair and place her in the chair on the podium or on the platform. And when the anointing would come, she would stand up and preach like she had no problems. And when it would lift, she'd get back in the chair, and they'd carry her back across and put her to bed. That's how she lived out the latter part of her life. Mrs. Etter is one of those people that if you want to follow somebody's faith and know that there's not going to be a great problem, it is her. Mother Etter is one of those whose doctrines were great to the end. Her moral life was great to the end. She overcame the problems that she faced with class and with clarity and with the decision not to give up no matter how bad it was. We can follow her natural example and her spiritual example. I hope you'll spend time and read more of her books and more of her sermons and understand here was a lady that had all 9 gifts of the Spirit, spoke in tongues, got people healed, cast out devils, all before the Azusa Street revival. She predates the outpouring of modern Pentecost, and she becomes the grandmother of the great movement of Pentecost, and we're so thankful she lived, she obeyed, and she didn't quit when things got rough. One of the great things we can learn from Mother Etter's life is when she goes through hard times, when she went through that great, terrible meeting, when she went to jail for practicing medicine without a license, when she buried both of her husbands and all of her kids died, she didn't get mad at God. She didn't give up. She didn't walk away. She stayed faithful to her call, faithful to her faith in Christ, and made the devil suffer because she kept doing what was right, kept preaching, kept obeying. When you go through a trial, when you go through a problem, don't let the emotions dictate to you. Let your decisions of your heart dictate to you, and always make the devil pay by doing good things for Jesus, representing him with boldness, with no shame and no fear, and finish your course on earth with everything complete. So when it's time to go, you've finished your course and you're ready to leave, and there's no regret and there's no complaint about what you've done.
Would you be free?